It wasn't a ship, it was a coffin.
It started like a whisper. A rumor carried by merchants on the wind murmured between ships and caravan tents. Whispers of a strange and terrible sickness spreading in the east. Few in Europe paid attention at first. After all, sickness came and went. It was part of life. But this would be different. In the early 1330s, somewhere in the depths of Central Asia, in the province of Yunnan in China, the plague was born. Historians still debate the exact origin, but all signs point to this region. Nestled between mountains and trade routes, Yunnan had everything the plague needed to thrive: people, animals, and movement. It began with rats, specifically the black rat. These rodents traveled easily aboard merchant ships and carts, and they carried a deadly passenger: fleas infected with a bacterium called Yersinia pestis. When one rat died, the fleas simply jumped to the next warm body, animal or human. And just like that, the chain of infection spread outward, silent and unseen. By the mid-1340s, the disease reached the bustling ports of the Black Sea. In 1347, it boarded Genoese trade ships docked in the city of Kaffa, a major trading hub on the Crimean Peninsula. The plague didn't knock politely, it stormed in, killing sailors and merchants alike. But the ships sailed on, fleeing the outbreak, unknowingly bringing death with them. Those ships made landfall in Sicily in October of 1347. That's when Europe's nightmare truly began. Within weeks, the disease had taken hold in Messina, then Palermo, and then spread like wildfire across Italy. From port to port, it leapt, using the Mediterranean trade routes as veins. Soon it was in Marseille, then in Genoa, and by 1348, it had breached the heart of France, Spain, and England. Nobody knew what it was. People called it many names: the pestilence, the great mortality, God's punishment. But its symptoms were clear and horrifying. It often started with a fever and chills. Victims would feel sudden, crushing fatigue. Then came the swellings, painful, blackened buboes that appeared in the groin, neck, or armpits. These buboes were the signature of the bubonic plague. Soon after, victims would cough up blood, suffer internal bleeding, and sometimes die within 72 hours of their first symptoms. There was no cure, no treatment, only prayers, fear, and despair. Families were torn apart. Entire households were wiped out in a matter of days. Doctors, powerless to help, often fled the cities they once served. Priests refused to administer last rites. Parents abandoned their children. Brothers left their sisters. The social fabric unraveled quickly. In towns and villages, bodies piled up faster than they could be buried. Graveyards overflowed. Mass graves, deep pits hastily dug, became the norm. The stench of decay hung over every town. The dead were left where they fell, sometimes for days. Death was no longer a private affair. It was everywhere, inescapable. In Venice, city officials tried quarantine measures, closing ports and isolating the sick. But it was too late. In Avignon, Pope Clement VI sat between two roaring fires in a desperate attempt to keep the bad air at bay. He survived, but tens of thousands in the papal city didn't. Fear infected every corner of society, and with fear came blame. Many pointed fingers at outsiders, minorities, and especially Jewish communities. Accusations of well poisoning and witchcraft spread faster than the disease itself. Pogroms erupted across Europe. Entire Jewish villages were massacred, not by the plague, but by their neighbors. Others turned to religion with extreme fervor. Groups of flagellants, roving bands of penitents, marched from town to town, whipping themselves in public to atone for humanity's sins. They believed the plague was God's punishment for a sinful world. Their processions, dramatic and bloody, were often banned by authorities, but they continued to draw crowds desperate for answers. Some sought pleasure, trying to drink and feast their way to distraction. "Eat, drink, and be merry," they said, "for tomorrow we die." But most people lived in silence and dread. The sound of cartwheels groaning through narrow streets became a common sign of death's approach. The cry of the dead collector, "Bring out your dead," haunted neighborhoods like a bell tolling for all. By the end of 1348, the Black Death had swept across southern Europe. By mid-1349, it reached the British Isles and Scandinavia. Even remote villages high in the Alps or tucked away in the forests of Poland were not spared. In just 2 years, it had done the unthinkable. It changed everything. It's estimated that 1/3 to half of Europe's population died. That's tens of millions of people, in a time when the global population was far smaller than today. Some cities lost 60% or more of their people. Entire villages vanished from the map. Governments collapsed. The economy halted. Fields went unplowed. Cattle wandered the roads unattended. Churches lost congregations. Shops closed. Time itself seemed to pause. Chronicles from the time speak in tones of awe and terror. Boccaccio, in his Decameron, wrote about young people fleeing the cities to the countryside in hopes of surviving. Others wrote of cities so quiet you could hear the wind through the empty market stalls. Even the concept of death itself changed. Once viewed as a distant event in old age or war, death became an everyday reality, random, rapid, and often unseen until it was too late. The lines between life and death blurred. Many started believing they were living in the end times. Art began to reflect this obsession with mortality. Frescoes showed skeletons dancing among the living. Churches painted vivid scenes of judgment and damnation. Life's fragility was on full display in every painting, carving, and hymn. And yet, even amid the darkness, people adapted. Life had to go on somehow. Survivors inherited lands, titles, and responsibilities they never expected. The old world was dying, but a new one, shaped by the horrors of the Black Death, was beginning to form. Merchants who survived became richer as trade resumed. Farmers could demand better pay. Workers were suddenly in high demand. The balance of power between peasants and nobles began to shift. Not everything about the plague's aftermath was bleak. In some ways, it sparked change. It forced people to question their beliefs, their systems, their way of life. It opened doors to science, medicine, and eventually the Renaissance. The plague forced innovations in public health. Cities began to track the sick, quarantine ships, and regulate sanitation. In Italy, officials invented the word quarantine, from 40 giorni, meaning 40 days. The period ships had to wait offshore before unloading. That practice alone likely saved thousands of lives. Some towns created early versions of death registries. Others isolated entire families or neighborhoods. It was brutal but necessary. These early policies laid the groundwork for modern epidemiology. Meanwhile, medical practitioners, once guided solely by superstition or classical texts, began taking notes. They tracked symptoms, recorded patterns, and started experimenting with treatments. even if most didn't work. Still, it was a start. Of course, not all reactions were noble. Some leaders hid in countryside estates while their people died. Some doctors charged outrageous sums for false cures. Some clergy turned their backs on their flocks. But there were also heroes, people who stayed behind to help the sick, bury the dead, or comfort the grieving. Their names aren't remembered, but their courage helped hold the fabric of society together. By 1351, the worst of the plague had passed in most areas, but its scars ran deep. Entire generations were shaped by the trauma. Children who grew up surrounded by death became adults with a different world view, more cautious, more questioning, and in some cases, more determined to change things. This was no ordinary plague. It was a world-changing event, a reset button on history. And in part 2, we'll look at how Europe, battered and broken, began to rebuild, and how the legacy of the Black Death still echoes through our world today.